Hello, Robbie. Welcome to Do Good and Do Well. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm pretty good, Sarah. Thanks for having me. My fingers are a little bit cold. I just noticed I'm sitting on my fingers. That's quite a little boy thing to do, isn't it? But my fingers are a little bit cold. The heating is warming up this room as we speak, so I'll probably be too warm by the end. But no, I'm
You'll
good
be
today. Thank you.
sweating. I'll
Maybe.
be, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We haven't got the heating on yet. We're trying to go for as long as possible, but I do have my slippers on and my blanket,
Yeah.
so I'm
Yeah.
nice and comfy.
Important. Yeah,
Yeah.
very
If I could
important.
have a fire just by the side, that
Yeah.
would be
Be
perfect.
nice. Be good for
Fireside chat.
podcast background noise as well,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? Little
Oh,
crackles every now and again.
that would be nice.
You
Yeah.
could, you could just next podcast. You can just say that you've moved into a different room with a fire, and just have like a little, like your TV, or you can get it
Yeah.
on your
Yeah. The
phone, like
sound
fire
effect.
sound.
I might do that. I did say to you earlier, didn't I? I had to kick the dog out because she
Yeah.
she was cleaning herself, and I thought, no, this is not a sound that people want to hear on this podcast.
Well,
Anyway,
fire crackling might be. Yeah.
fire crackling is more comfortable, probably. Um, Robbie, first question: can you share a bit about yourself? Who are you? What do you do? Tell us.
So I had a funny realization earlier this year, and I'm probably gonna do that instantly after saying this. That I realized I'd got to a point about 7 years into the stuff that I do now, where I didn't anymore feel the need to say. And before I did this, I used to do and talk about that, right? So it's like an interesting thing, I think, when you start something new, where for a while I used to kind of say, well, now I work as a coach, and before that I worked in this and that and did this, and now it's
Yeah.
like it's fine. I can just say the things I do now, which is lovely. So I work as a coach, mostly, but also do some training and facilitation, as people who do work with people in one way often end up doing some of it in others too. And I am also a writer and a podcaster. And again, those are different identities that I've adjusted to over the years. Um, and the way that I think about my work mostly these days, the things that I'm interested in my work, is there are kind of three parts of it. I'm really interested in leadership, and there's
Mm.
a few reasons for that. But one of the things I often find myself doing leadership work on, and I do that a lot of my one-on-one work is leadership work, but also some of the group work. I do it across sectors, all kinds of people in different scales of organizations. It's kind of how I like it. But one of the themes I noticed showing up was this kind of question that would often come, or the challenge that people would often bring to the work with me, is something like this. I kind of know where I want to get to, but I believe that to get to that point, I have to do some things that I don't want to do.
Yes.
I have to, and on a deep level, that's sometimes like I have to actually compromise who I
Yeah.
am to get to that place,
Mm.
and I don't believe that that's ever the case. So the thought experiment, therefore, the work is often, how do we help you get to the place you want to get to, that new level of success, without having to compromise who you are, being able to do it in line
Mm.
with what you actually, how you actually believe things should be done.
Yeah.
Um, so that's the leadership piece. I'm also really interested in creativity in the kind of broadest possible sense. So one of the things that I get interested in, because this is my story, right, is why do we sometimes really want to do something, start something, make something happen from nothing? Sometimes a creative pursuit, classic creative pursuit, like writing or
Mm.
music or something like that. But sometimes something that's definitely creative but not classically thought of as creative, like starting a business. Why do we sometimes really
Yeah.
want to do those things sometimes for a long time? Know we do deep down, but don't do anything about that. And how do we help people bridge that gap between I want to do this thing and finally doing it? And that's a chunk of my work is about that. That's what my books are about.
Mm.
Um, and then I'm also really interested in the craft of coaching. So I just think it has so much to offer. So many of the challenges that humans face in the 21st century, coaching can be a valuable part of the solution too. And so I do have
Mm.
some work. I have a podcast for coaches, and I have some work around supporting other coaches. And I sometimes do coaching training and things like that as
Mm.
well. So
Mm.
yeah, that's what I do really.
Mm. Leadership, creativity, coaching.
Yeah.
How did you arrive at this place? I'm interested.
Yeah. Well, I should say how I arrived at talking about it like that was I just thought about it one day and thought, oh, maybe I'll start trying to talk about it like that for a bit and see if that lands. And
Mm.
it felt really good. And so
Yeah.
I've kept doing it, talking about it like that for quite a while. I think I thought for a
Mm.
long time I had to have one thing. And then
Yeah.
I realized that that's a made up story, isn't it? I don't have to do that. I can do whatever the heck I like when someone
Yeah.
asks who I am and what I do. And I can talk about three things if I want. Um,
Yeah.
so to a certain extent, that's That's how
Mm.
well, like I had a kind of the first decade of my career, I dotted around quite a lot. It was quite stressful at the time. I had, a few different things that I did. And every time I changed, that felt quite stressful. Because I was like, well, no, I don't have to leave this thing behind as well, do I? Not again, essentially. And the biggest chunk of that was in arts and culture, which, we were just comparing mutual people that we knew from previous careers before we switched on the recording. And then when that ended or was coming to an end, I was thinking a lot about the kind of unused parts of me, or the ways in which I wasn't. One of the things that happened for me, for example, when I used to be the manager of, a chunk of that time was I was the manager of a couple of art centres in North Yorkshire. I was living at the time.
Okay.
In lots of ways, I'd worked quite hard to get into those roles, and for a while, I thought in the back of my mind, the future looked like moving to more influential, more impactful venues. One day end up at the South Bank Centre or Sheffield Theatres would be a great dream. And at some point I realized that would be a terrible thing if that happened to me, essentially. I don't remember when that was, but essentially I kind of had this insight when I look back on that time now, which was I was really proud of and loved the things that I helped to make happen. So I'm so glad that at Otley, I was a part of Otley in West Yorkshire's Arts Centre history.
Yeah.
And I always will be now, as long as it's still there. And thankfully it survived the pandemic. So I'm so proud of that. And I'm so pleased that I was part of that, and the volunteers and the audience members and all the people that were impacted. But the actual doing the work, I often didn't enjoy that much. And it actually kind of drained me of energy. Some of it did anyway. So the question, as I had a kind of, as many people do, late 20s, early 30s, had a kind of something's off in lots of areas of my life, and a reset. And a part of that was, what's the work that the actual work, I'll be proud of the impact, and I'll be proud of the actual work that I'm doing day to day, minute to minute, ideally. And that in the end, after some false start, I found my way to people through that. Like I was a quite, I don't know, it'd be interesting if any of my staff from Otley or Northallerton are listening, like if they think this, I felt like I was looking back, quite a mediocre line manager. Example of this, we had wonderful one-to-ones. Like we came out of the one-to-ones feeling like full of energy, me and my team members usually, but we did them once every like 6 months or year. And it's just like, what was that about? And as I looked back on that period, though, I spotted a pattern of stuff to do with people. So after some false starts, I found coaching about 7 years ago, started my coaching business, and essentially it's been a process of experimentation since then. I didn't know how that would end up. There's no way I could have predicted. And if I tried to predict those 3 things that I said to you a few minutes ago, 7 years ago, I wouldn't have done it. And even if I had, it wouldn't have worked. It had to be found via all kinds of stages in that journey.
Yeah, that it sounds so familiar to my journey, for want of a better word. Really, that I loved my work. I really, and I felt like I worked for a great organization, and it was family friendly. I had 2 small children at the time. There were so many things. It ticked so many boxes, but there was something that just didn't sit right anymore for me. And I came into coaching, I did a course. I didn't think that I was going to run my own business. In fact, I'd spent probably about 20 years going, I could never be freelance, I could never run my own business. And then launched, my practice March 2020, which is a great time to launch a business, but it didn't look, I had imagined in my head it would look face to face, it would look, quite working with, locally, but the whole pandemic shifting online has utterly changed. I could never have predicted that. And there's something quite exciting about that, because then I think to the future and I think, well, what am I not able to predict now? Like, and I love what you said about how you landed on those sort of 3 things. And it does take practice. And in fact, in the group program I run for freelancers, we were just talking about how you describe yourself as a freelancer. Like, what does consultant mean? What does a coach mean? And And actually, why can't we be more than one thing? Because actually, most freelancers are more than one thing. So to try and pin it down, do we really need to do that? And I love that the way that you described your work, because you're not necessarily talking about what you do, you know, all the things that you do, but you're talking about, you know, how and what you want to achieve through those things.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I really owe a debt of, you know, I've stolen and borrowed and been inspired by so many people. And one of my former coaches, a guy called Rich Litvin, I owe a lot of that to him. So when he, you know, what I remember, one of the things I remember Rich kind of teaching me was, you don't have to accept the premise of the question, what do you do?
Mm.
Right. And you can just say, Rich was funny, but he would always catch people and do this, be like, the bridge from what do you do to anything you want to talk about is, it's funny you should ask. You know, you can just basically say that, and then you'd say after that, so what do you do? It's funny you should ask. And then you can say anything, right? You can do what I did, which is say, you know, in a way I kind of said, what's more interesting than what I do is what I'm interested in.
Mm.
And here's what I'm interested in. Or you can say, well, it's funny you should ask. The last piece of work that I was doing before I got here was X.
Mm.
And the way I think about that question, after quite a lot of reflection, and back in the days where we did meet people face to face more, you know, what I wanted from my answer to the question, what do you do, or tell me about yourself, is to engage, you know, for the right people to be curious to ask me more about something. So if I just say I'm a coach, they've really only got one question, which is, well, I can say about three things. One of them is like, what is coaching? Another is, oh, here's my experience of coaching. And then
Yeah.
really their third option is just like what most people do, which is a kind of like, oh, you know, and that's
Yeah.
a perfectly valid response. And or they might say, what kind of coach, which is a
Yeah.
kind of like,
Yeah.
you know, the small talk way of saying, I want to have something polite to say, but I don't know what, and so I'm going to ask about that.
Yeah.
You know, and so the nice thing about me just talking about leadership, creativity, and coaching is that gives people three opportunities to be interested in something.
Mm.
Now, it probably took me like 3 minutes or something, maybe longer. I talk a lot to say that to you. And so it's not for everyone at every time. And sometimes I
Yeah.
might say,
Yeah.
well, what I'm most interested in at the moment is, and just choose one of them. And probably if this was a podcast for coaches, I would have spoken mostly about that. If it was a podcast
Mm.
for only leaders, or, you know, it's like,
Mm.
because I know that you are interested in all those things.
Mm.
You know, and because of I ended up accidentally saying all of them, you know, it's
Yeah.
not really thought through. It's just, yeah, but it's like, we don't have to, you're right. Like what is it? It's like humans are complex.
Mm.
And in a way, no answer to tell me about yourself is going to hold the complexity of a human. But especially going to a job title, which we're so used to doing, because it is a useful shorthand,
Yeah.
doesn't do that usually, especially for
Yeah.
freelancers, like you say. Yeah.
Well, I think also, you know, if we're putting on our business mindset as freelancers running our own business, whatever you want to call it, you know, there needs to be a bit of agility about how you describe what you do, because you want to connect. You know, ultimately, if you know, we're here, we're in this context, but you might be in a meeting where you might have potential clients that are in that room with you. And so it's really kind of understanding how you can connect with those people so it makes sense for you, but also for those people as well, to go, okay, then as you say, it's that hook, isn't it? I'm interested in that
Yeah.
as well. And maybe
Or it
we
might
need
be
to
like,
have a
oh, Alice is really interested in, the way he talked
yes.
about that then. Because in a way, Sarah, we are in a room now with other people
Yeah,
who might be clients, right?
yeah.
Both of us are, because there's people listening. And yeah, like it could be, yeah, like, oh, there's the connection, exactly like you say, with the person across the room. But it could also be, oh, and you know who's interested? Oh, that thing he said about
Mm,
not having started the business. That's a bit like my sister and her idea for that cafe.
yeah.
Maybe I should just look into him a bit more and then find the thing. And that's kind of what you hope. And you're right. Like, I think
Mm,
that, so one of the things I think for things I feel like I've learned from 7 years of freelance business is there are a lot of things that people tell you
mhm.
you need to do to grow a freelance business, but there are actually very few things that you have to do. So it doesn't matter what people say, but there are a few things that if you don't do them, it's almost impossible to have a freelance business.
Yeah.
One of them is connecting with people. Like, if you don't ever connect with anyone in any way, it's not impossible, because there are some kind of like jobbing freelance websites that you could maybe get away without really connecting with somebody, but it's pretty hard.
It's hard
But
work.
whereas the other way around, if you connect with a lot of people in some ways, as long as you're doing some talking about your business, almost can't help but have some clients if you connect with enough people.
Yeah. So in terms of, so I ask this question on every episode: what does do good and do well mean for you? And I wonder whether you can talk about it through the lens of you as a, having a freelance business and being self-employed. What does that phrase mean to you?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot in it. It's why it's a good question and a good name for a show, right? But so the first thing is, it makes me think of a guy called Jordan Hall, who I saw speak at an event once. He's a strange character. If you watch some of him on YouTube, you have to watch it takes about 20 minutes for me to settle into his way of thinking, which is quite alien to me. But usually people who think really differently, it's like I've got a connection who's really interested in neurodiversity, and it's like, if you think really differently, you see different things, and that's really painful when you kind of want to be you want to fit in. But in the end, the reason Jordan Hall is interesting to me is because he thinks in a really interesting way. And he was once asked a question at an event I was at. It's a great question. It was like, in the face of all these crises on the planet, what can we do? And the other people on the panel gave really smart answers, and then Jordan Hall said this thing which felt like it was just like a different level of answer. And what he said is, in the face of complexity, basically, he's thought a lot. He said, I've thought about this for about, it was a great response. He said, I thought about this for about 10 years. Would you like to hear what I've come up with? Thankfully, the person was like, yes, please tell us this thing. And he said, in the face of complexity, there are really two things we can do in the face of the crises of the planet. And he is more pessimistic. I mean, he's an optimistic guy, but he really believes there are a lot of crises and has done a lot of thinking about that.
Yeah.
Two things you can do: work out the thing that you can do that nobody else can do. That unique mix of your experience, good things and bad things that have happened to you, things you've practiced, what that is. And then do the work on yourself so you can be what he calls being sovereign, which essentially means being able to manage yourself in the face of difficult things that are happening. And the reason that's important is because that's how you can be sure. So the problem in complexity is a lot of the things we do to try and help can have unexpected impacts and can make things worse. And it's one of the tragedies of the environmental movement is the times when really well-meaning policies have done damage, unexpected damage in unexpected parts of the world. And that's because you can't control it, because it's all a complex system. But you can do that if you've done as much work on yourself to understand yourself and be sovereign, be centered as much time as possible. You can be as sure as you can be that the things you're doing are making things better and not worse. And so I guess that is the reverse of do good, do well. That is do well, which is find that place where you can make the biggest possible contribution. And then do good, which is do everything you can to understand yourself and how you are so that you're making things better and not worse. And then in a freelance sense, I actually think freelancers are that's one of the really interesting things about having a freelance portfolio. If you think about that first bit of what he says, the unique mix of things that only you can do. Well, if we all had to have a job that was advertised with a job description, the chances of that fitting exactly with what a single human can do is much less likely than if I start a freelance career 7 years ago, you start one 2 years ago, we both just evolved them. We're both constantly selecting for what we enjoy, what we seem to be good at, what people will pay us for, and people are doing the same thing with us. Often, especially if we're thinking about this, and I've been thinking about this in my work quite a lot, because it's part of what I got into this for, we're going to end up somewhere in that space where we're doing things almost as well as we could. And that's one of the things that brought me into this. Like I said, I had this sense I wasn't quite getting well used or as well used by my work as I could be, given everything I could do. And that's been one of the themes of my career. The times I've moved and changed ideas has been often, oh, there's this whole bit of me that's not getting used here. What's that about, and how can I use it? So that's quite a long answer to that question, Sarah.
But it
what's
is,
landed for you?
it's a complicated, well, the thing I love about it is that the answers are always so different. For some people, it's a very simple phrase that that can easily be made sense of, but there is also a lot of complexity underneath it, even to the, well, what is good? What do we mean by good? And whose good is it? And what do we mean by well? And whose well is it? And yeah, I think that's what's fascinating, is that and what I love is that all of these ideas that come into play. And I'm so, the bit that really resonated with me when you were talking then was that idea of really being able to center yourself, and manage yourself as best you can. I do think that it, in a freelance sense, when we talk about leadership, people will often say, well, but I'm not leading anyone. I don't have a team, I'm not delegating, because it's often a business of one. But what I'm trying to support people with is thinking about, but how do you lead yourself in that? How do you really master the how you want to work? And often for freelancers, if you're going from, say, you were an employee and now you're running your own business, there feels like there's all these invisible rules that that people are still trying to stick to, that you've got to work these hours, and you've got to have, you've got to be an email all the time, and you've got, whatever it is. And I suppose when you were talking about that, well, what is it that, if you can really tune into yourself and think, what is it that really matters to me? What are my ideas? What's my vision? And then really think about how you do that in the best way that makes sense to you, the way you feel centered and you feel grounded, so that when the ground shakes, which it inevitably will, that you can, stand as strong as possible. Or if you get knocked down, you get back up again and continue on that road.
Yeah, so much. I mean, so much in what you've just said there. I think it is one of the most important things to do, really, to do the work on ourselves. It's like, I don't know if you get this. I think every year so far, like, it hasn't happened this year yet, so maybe it won't happen this year. It's the autumn now, so it's possible I'll get through the rest of the year. But every other year in my time as a freelancer, as a self-employed person, as an entrepreneur, I've had at least one time where I've been like, oh, this has got to stop. I've got to get a job. Like, what is the point of this? This is not worth it.
A month ago.
Yeah, exactly. So this may be, if this is the first year that it happens, that it doesn't happen, that will be a cause for celebration. But I think more than anything, it'll be a sense of chance, that it doesn't happen in a year, because the ground, as you said very wisely, like, the ground will shake under you in your life. The only time that stops happening is at the end of our life, when we don't have a life anymore. Like, otherwise it's going to happen, and it's going to happen regularly. And so really, in some ways, it'd be luck, I think, that it hasn't happened so much this year. So I think, having your own business is a great personal development exercise, right? If you want to learn a lot about yourself, maybe having children is a better one. Trying to have a long-term relationship is a really good one as well. If you want to kind of learn a lot about yourself, do those three things. But being centered, very important. Especially, I think for both, because of course I know that a thing that you care about, and I do too, is how do we help people who care a lot make their work, which is really important, sustainable. So if you're trying to do good, how do you do that without? And I've got a friend who does a lot of work with people in the environmental movement and sees this a lot. It happens. I used to work in arts and culture and leadership, and it happens a lot there. I mean, it happens everywhere that people really care. If you care a lot, you want to give a lot, and then there's this question, like, what happens if you give too much. And
Mm.
again, that personal growth, that centeredness, that's one of the things I think which enables us to cope through those times as well.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, yeah, I think there is there are well, not many times. There are times when it just feels hard. It feels
Yeah.
hard and tricky, and um there are two things that I would do at those moments. Two, maybe three things. The first is I speak to my coach, or speak to someone who I can just like go, I'm really struggling, like I just don't know what my next step is, or I feel stuck, or like I just help, basically ask for help. And then the second is to go back to my why, go back to why I did this in the first place, and it was because I wanted to challenge myself. I wanted to see if I could run a successful business. I wanted to have a business that served me, not the other way around. I wanted to make more money than I could do working in arts and culture. um you know and, and and so when I'm having those moments, it is those are the centering bits for me, to really just get back to the core, and then maybe that's full, and then take a next step, like
Yeah.
do the next thing, because otherwise you can just sit in your head too much and overthink it. But if I take action, then I can somehow move forward. um and which reminds me, your 12-minute method, that's about taking action, isn't it? And about doing something. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's like really, it's connected into everything we're talking about, really. So I'll tell the story of it really briefly. Essentially, um, about 6 years ago, I was working with my coach and essentially doing this work that we're talking about, like looking at the things that I found really difficult and trying to be more like a higher version of myself, a more centered version of myself in those
Mm.
times. And one of them was like posting anything online. I was finding that
Oh.
incredibly difficult. I mean, at the time, it wasn't like stuff that I'd made so much. I mean, that was hard, but it was even like I was changing. My relationship to social media was changing. Like I had found it quite a fun place to be, and I was finding it a really anxious place to be.
Mm.
Um, and Joel, my coach at the time, and I created a practice which was going to be on my train journey from Clapham Junction to Waterloo in London. Over the next 2 weeks, I was going 5 times, and on each of the days that I was going, I was going to write a little article on the train, right while the train's moving, stop when it stops, proof it once, post it online,
Mm.
post it on LinkedIn because no one reads LinkedIn, was what I thought. And it was more true in 2016 than it is
Yeah.
now. I think it's quite a good blogging platform now.
Mm.
Um, and it didn't feel fun, and it didn't feel nice. But it kind of, by the end of those 2 weeks, I knew something was up with it. Like, I
Mm.
guess the way I think about it now is it felt good. It felt like the right thing to be doing. And so I decided to make it into a weekly practice. And essentially, I've been doing it now for more than 6 years.
Mm.
And at some point, I stopped getting the train as much. So I checked how long the train journey was, and it was 12 minutes that day. Although it's funny because it's very arbitrary, the 12-minute method, which is now like a big part of the work I do. Because the train is rarely 12 minutes from Waterloo to Clapham Junction, which is the journey I was on that day. And it's often 7 or 13 or 15, all kinds of things. So it could have been any number. That's perfect, right? Because the number doesn't really matter. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
so what I do now is I set a timer for 12 minutes, right while the timer's going, stop when it stops, proofread it once and post it. And they're still on LinkedIn, but they're also on my website now because it's a bit easier to navigate. And 12 minutes, it turns out, is a pretty good number if you want to have a writing practice.
Mm.
But it doesn't have to be. And one of the things that still amazes me about that is about 3 years in, for various reasons, including the fact that they were only on LinkedIn at the time, the blogs, and LinkedIn's a really hard place to read. It's hard for me to find my own blogs on LinkedIn, let alone for somebody who wanted to read my blogs to find them.
Yeah.
I realized, and then I saw someone had published a book of their blog, basically. And I was like, I could do that. That'd be fun. And I thought it'd be funny because I could call it, I wrote this book in 12 minutes. And it turned out that I'd written 80,000 words,
Wow.
12 minutes a week over 3 years. So there's like
God.
130, 140 of these articles, 80,000 words. And what my friend who was going to help me with the editing said was like, that's a fun title. I wrote this book in 12 minutes, because it's kind of in your face, and it says, look, if Robbie can write a book in 12 minutes, what's your excuse for not doing that thing you've been meaning to do? But he asked, can the book do that itself? And this was a really interesting moment. Like, I sat down with my coach at that point. There's a woman called Katie Harvey, and we thought about it, and she helped me think about if I was going to sit down and try and help somebody do a thing they've been meaning to do for a long time, what are the stages that they would have to go through? And I wrote them out, or 4 of them. And then I sat down with like all 130 printed off blog posts, and I dealt them out. And what was amazing was, if you take out like 5 or 6 and a few that are duplicates, they actually pretty much went exactly into these 4 stages. And those were going to be the 4 parts of that one book. In the end, I decided it was better, more accessible to have them as 4 separate books, and actually better. It's a better business model as an author as well. But I had a conversation the other day with somebody who was like, so the stages are the 4 books in the 12-minute method series. So you have to start. Yeah. You have to keep going. You have to not quit if you want to make something happen. You have to at some point share your work if you want it to make a difference. And if you want to do great work, like if you want to do that thing that Jordan Hall was talking about, do the absolute best work you can, then you probably at some point want to think about how you create the conditions for your best work. And that's the 3rd book in the series, because it felt weird not to have share last, but it is the 4th most important of those 4 stages, because the 3 most important conditions for doing great work are to start it, to keep it going, and at some point to share it with other people. And then one of the reasons it's a series is it was a great example. I had a conversation with somebody the other day who said, oh yeah, I'm a great starter, but it's the keeping going that's the hard bit. And then of course the lesson, there are a bunch of lessons in there about that are relevant to what we're doing now. One though is like small action regularly can lead to amazing things. 12 minutes of writing once a week. Sometimes people confuse it with daily. No, once a week. Yeah. For 3 years was 80,000 words. So it's like, where else is that? And actually, one of my podcasts, I have a 12-minute method podcast where I'm investigating the other things that are a bit like that have happened in my life, and like that I've done, that I've wanted to do for a long time. And of course, there are others that I wanted to do and didn't do or haven't done. But the ones that I have done, it's like, what do they have in common? And how can we learn lessons from that about why we sometimes don't do the things that we want to? And I guess the 12-minute method stuff, Sarah, it also kind of resonates with all of this work that you're doing, because, well, first of all, it's about like, how do we, like, it's better to do a little bit of good every week for a long time than to do no good because it feels too overwhelming. And for me, it's like a tortoise and hare story. So it's like, I for example, if I hope that my writing does good. I hope that even just one person reads each article and it has some tiny positive impact on them. When I started out writing, there were people that I really admire and respected who inspired my writing, who had written a lot more articles than me, probably for good reasons. They haven't consistently written articles at the speed they were writing. And I have now written more than them by doing 1 a week for 6 years. The other thing is that occurs to me is like, these things that we want to do deep down and haven't been doing, whether that's a change in ourselves or a business or a creative project or a book or something different, I haven't yet had anyone say one of those to me that what didn't tilt the world a little bit towards the good stuff or the true stuff or the beautiful stuff. So I think there's something in those creative impulses around doing good, which is important. And when it comes to, I like what you said earlier, just one more thought about how do we know what good is and whose definition of good. I don't know the answer to that. And so I'm more than happy. That's why that work is work for everyone, really. Like, because it's like, I don't know who's got the thing. The really good thing. The really one that'll make much more difference than my thing. But if I can help them just do that little tiny step to start, then that's very exciting. And I love it when you find, the pandemic. So I've taken it down and packed it up because we're about to move house. I had this lovely, like in the pandemic, somebody couldn't go to their job because of the lockdowns, and they made this beautiful handmade models of characters from some of my favorite books. And I just love it when those things happen. It definitely improves my life. And
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so much in what you said there. Yeah. I just think that idea of consistency, like the idea of taking a step and doing it consistently, can be amazing, especially so if I'm thinking about the people I work with who they see injustice. They see that there is something wrong with the world. Either they're in it, that they've experienced it themselves, or they're really very close to it and they're observing it. And it might be on a micro scale of something like an organization could do better, or it could be something in their local community, or it could be on a macro scale. This is something that needs to happen in the whole world. But there is that fear of showing up to say those things, the fear of not of someone judging them, because I love the fact that you only proof it once. I'm like a big believer in progress over perfection. And when I write my newsletter, I only give myself a certain amount of time, because it's more than 12 minutes though. But I might try the 12-minute thing. That might be better. But otherwise I just will spend, I mean, I'm not a perfectionist. I've never been a perfectionist, thank goodness. But I don't want to overthink it. I just want to get it out. I want to get it out, because then it's just there and people will judge it. I can't control that. And so it's that idea of having something very small, tangible, that there's consistency, that you have a kind of ground rules, a framework that you follow each time. It just takes some of that thinking out of it, takes some of the overthinking out, and it builds confidence, isn't it? It's that it's building that self-efficacy of going, well, I don't know what actually this, I don't know what's going to come from this, but I do know I can do it. I don't know how to solve it, but I know that I can do something. And so I think it's such a good method to bring it really, like, pare it back and just be thinking to yourself, what is it I can do that's consistent and regular and helps me to feel safer in this pursuit. Because I think, your example of saying, there is something, I think sometimes I feel, where it's almost, it's like, where's my voice gone? Like, I'm looking at LinkedIn, I'm like, I really want to reply, I really want to write something in this comment box here that somebody said, but there's something stopping me. Like, literally, I feel like I've got no voice. But by going into LinkedIn regularly, which I do now, and I just comment on 3 or 4 posts, it just eases it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, the self-efficacy point is a really important part of this. Like, I think there's 2 things to say about this. So there's one from like an individual point of view about that kind of feeling that you're talking about, or the kind of feeling of being judged holding us back. And there's another thing about making a difference to overwhelming problems. So I'll do the first one first, which is that practice for me, interestingly, that became the 12-minute blog. It wasn't really a writing practice, right? It was a practice in getting comfortable sharing stuff that I'd made online. And it did not happen overnight, right? It took years. Like I am now, basically. So if you think about it, what I really set out to be, and this is a great way to plan some kind of regular, consistent practice if you want to transform yourself, is like, I wanted to be someone who could essentially share stuff that they thought or about themselves online without it feeling horrible.
Yeah.
And we made a practice to do that, which was write a thing in 12 minutes, essentially on the train, and then in 12 minutes, in the end, once a week. And over 6 years, that has happened. I am that person now. Like, I have changed. It didn't happen overnight, though. I remember posts 3-4 years in for sure that were like, had a lot of energy. It's like, am I really going to write this? Am I really going to share it? And so but they were less frequent by that point, and they're even less frequent now.
Mm.
So we can change, and a good way to think about that is, who would I like to be in 5 years?
Yeah.
What does that person do regularly? And then how can I do that in a way that, what did you say, that I can do in a consistent and regular way? There's a 12-minute practice for you. If you can, it might be 20 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour. It doesn't really matter, as long as it's a number that you're confident you can do every week. And I really think there are so many impacts from this writing practice on me personally, on how I've changed and grown and become who I am, that it's very hard to like even talk about, because there's been so much that's changed. So that's one piece. And then the other piece about the overwhelming problems, if you want to kind of use the same idea to attack that, is it's to think, here's an overwhelming thing. It's to start getting obsessed about what is enough, I think. So it's like, for me to feel like I'm doing my bit this week to do with this big thing, perhaps this big injustice, what's enough? Like, and one of the ways to think about that is, what's a thing that I know will make a difference, that if enough people did it enough times, a dent would happen in this challenge, in this injustice.
Yeah.
And then that's the task then, to just stick with that. Now it's to just stick with that is like a huge thing, which we could have a whole nother conversation about, because in a way, the most transformational thing for me about the 12-minute practice is I now know I'm someone who can choose a practice and stick with it for 6 years. That's who I am now. And that I've got to be honest, Sarah, I only had this insight this year when I was working on the second book, the Keep Going book. But like, that actually changes pretty much everything about what seems possible in life. Because if I believe, as I do, that most things are about practice, and that most changes happen, they don't happen through one fell swoop and one amazing day or week. They happen with consistent stuff over years. And I know that if I choose to practice something or do something regularly, I can keep it going for basically as long as I want. Then almost everything, it becomes possible. I just have to choose the right thing now to last for the long term.
I think what I'm hearing is that you were really obsessed with the process. It wasn't necessarily, it didn't start with the outcome. It was, really getting obsessed with the process of the practice, of like doing it in that way, and then and trusting that something would come from it. And that is really exciting to hear you say, like, what's possible. Like, I've realized that I am that person. So actually, like, the vision that I might have for my life, my business, whatever, can be really expansive. I can really step into that, because this is possible.
Absolutely. And you're right about process. Like, my investigation on the 12-minute method podcast that's been one of the things that's kept coming back for me. Now, I've got to say, this is me. Like, I'm doing an investigation to myself, right? Now, I have worked with lots and lots of clients, and I have read the work of many people who have done more kind of speech marks official research than me. But detaching from, attachment to a particular outcome is a classic A, overwhelm, and B, reason for procrastination for me. And obsessing about the process, you're absolutely right. It has enabled me to get into action much more. But I also think if we're humble enough, like we've talked before, it's the start of the conversation, isn't it? It's like, we don't know where things are going to turn out. Like, I'm not a god. I can't know what will actually make a difference in the world. Like, I've got no idea what will solve the problems people talk about environment, or about race, or about all these things we might have. Right? I've got no idea about that. But I can get into the granular detail of my corner of the world and go, is there a good thing I can do here? And what will be good for me as a human to grow and develop? And those are both those things which are, going back to Jordan Hall, it's like that's in a way, do good and do well again, I think.
I'm conscious of time, but I've got there's a question I've been wanting to ask you, which is some of the things you've talked about. So you've talked a lot about working with other coaches, and you've been running this business 6 years. What do you feel when we talk about that idea of being really grounded, being ourselves, doing the work, feeling more expansive about what's possible, what's the thing that you've really invested in that's enabled all of that to happen? Because it doesn't just happen, does it? That does take time and energy and effort and motivation and a thought to begin with, if I want to do that. Like, so for people who want to grow their practice, their work, what would you suggest investing in?
I mean, look at it at a high level. So there's probably two ways to answer that. On a kind of simple level, I like some form of reflective practice. So I've used coaching, and that means that every time bad stuff is happening, speech marks bad stuff, I'm struggling, I'm in the lull, I'm in the dip, I'm thinking about quitting, I'm learning from that. And there's like especially if your work is about you as a human, like if you're if you're the instrument of the work, then that's like the best investment you can ever do. Because and it's true for everyone really, because you're never going to leave yourself behind, right? Again, until the end, you're going to be stuck with yourself. So you might as well invest in it. So that's one. But what that's really helped me do is to continue to do things that scare me. I think that's the posting things online. That's those articles that made me squirm 4 years in. It's like publishing books now. It's like each of those things helps me grow. And if you think about that self-efficacy thing you were talking about, like that's what happens, right? We do the thing, the self-efficacy, the confidence comes after. Really, 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 like, cannot be overstated the importance of this thing, right? The confidence comes after, and what you need before is courage, which is acting in the face of fear. Like, it's just like one of the most important things.
Yeah, and the word courage comes from heart, doesn't it? Core is heart. And so investing in our heart, investing in ourselves enables us to get some of that courage, which then has that knock-on effect. And yeah, I think that's that's a really lovely way of thinking about it. We could have probably about 10 episodes on this podcast, but we're gonna sum it up. So how can people find out about you? How can they read your books? How can they access your podcast? Tell us all the things.
So the best place to go is my slightly unwieldy now website, www.robbieswale.com. I say unwieldy because it wasn't planned, right? I just started it doing the minimum viable website 7 years ago, and now it's where it is. Does need someone smarter than me to get hold of again, and I think make it more manageable. But you will find everything on there or linked to from there. If people want the podcasts, they're on all the podcast places. I'm sure wherever people are listening to this, they'll be there. So the one for coaches is The Coach's Journey, and that's conversations with coaches about essentially like an investigation into, there are 1,000 ways you can run a coaching business, and so they, what are the ways that some people have done that, to give us the chance to really choose one that's right for us. And everyone's will be different. And the 12-minute method one I've talked about as well. You can find the books. They're on Amazon, but they're also on, in the UK, they're on Waterstones and Blackwell's websites, places like that. I think in theory, you can go into those places and order them. I doubt they're stocking them because they've never heard of me until they've listened to this show. If you're a Waterstones buyer listening, then I recommend you buy my books in. Yeah, and I'm on social media as well. The place I go mostly these days is LinkedIn, because I've been going there for 6 years to posting these articles. So it's become my social media home. Love to hear from people that have heard me on the show. Just let me know that you heard me on the show, that you're not going to try and sell me some LinkedIn funnel, because I sometimes ignore people that I suspect might do that. So especially important to let me know you heard me on the show if your job title on LinkedIn is LinkedIn salesman. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from people, really. Like I love those reflections. And when I've thought in the last year about like what are the most meaningful things for me, one of them is, with the 12-minute method in mind, is people who, like, the most meaningful feedback I can get is someone saying, I've been meaning to do or wanting to do this thing for a long time, and then I came across your work, or I heard you talking to Sarah, and I've finally done it. And I love those stories, whether they are, I've had people talking about just like day to day, just doing the washing, instead of leaving it on a pile for a long time, or
or putting it away. That's the thing I struggle with.
Actually, it was putting it away. Was the story that my friend Alice talks about. I finally am doing this extension to our house that I've been avoiding doing for the last year. But also, of course, I finally started the business. I finally started writing. Like, I love reading. It's very meaningful to me, that people have sent me, here's this article that I wrote, either using the method or just inspired by the method. So love to hear all of that from people.
And I actually have one more question. So this year you challenged yourself to get on 100 podcasts, is that right? So what number am I?
I don't think I've got it in front of me. It's like 60. Well, you were one of the first people to support that challenge back in January, I think, or February. And so I'm really grateful to that. It's like it's not an insignificant thing, because it was like, I don't know, I think it was like a few days in, and you were somebody that I think I knew of. I think we had each other on Twitter or something, but I didn't know. And for someone like you to say, I'm up for this, I was like, oh, maybe it'll actually happen. And that you can find on my website some stuff about the 100 podcast challenge, because there's some interesting insight in there from other ways I've grown my business. Like, these kinds of challenges, if you can hold them lightly enough, like, and obsess about the process and the game, and not get too worried about where they lead, are fantastic. And a great example of that is us having this conversation that we just wouldn't have had otherwise, us connecting. Who knows what that connection will mean for us in 5 years. It might mean nothing, or it might mean loads. So I think this is like 60 something.
Okay. Doing good. So that's a lot of podcasts.
I was thinking about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, I was like, I'm going to get nowhere near this. And actually, I've got, like, including the ones that are scheduled in. Now, they won't all happen, of course, because that's life. But I'm up to about 80 already before the end of the year.
That's amazing.
So it's not impossible now, Sarah. Despite the fact that I would have said it was impossible up to about 6 weeks ago, maybe up to last month, maybe. So if anyone's listening and has a podcast that wants to have me, please let me know.
Although we're recording this mid-October, you'll probably be listening to it beginning of December, end of November, beginning of December.
Well, that'll be like the desperate time, Sarah. Like, I never work over Christmas, but if I'm on like 96, I'm going to be recording podcasts over Christmas, before New Year.
What are you willing to do to get to that 100 if you were on 96?
That's one of the things I found. Like, there's this, I'm not one to, this may be a just totally legit business, but basically it was like, I've said yes to a lot of things. Like, one of the good things about a challenge like this is times when my self-doubt would have stopped me saying yes. Instead, I've just said yes. Times when my self-doubt would have stopped me reaching out to people, I've reached out to people. And, I've been coached, for example, on YouTube and on people's podcasts. And it's like, I would have said no to that probably for various reasons, but I need to get to my 100. And if I don't say yes to this, I've got no chance. But I did have one, which was like a women in business summit thing. And they were after speakers. And I was like, I love this cause. I'd love to offer the 12-minute method to them. And then the requirement for I had to pay them 65 quid for them to interview me, from which they were going to select the speakers. And I just sat with it for about a few days, and I was like, I don't mind paying 65 quid to get to my 100. Like, that's perfectly fine. I've made some unexpected money from the challenge, from some of the things I've speaking at. But the feel that this might be a scam, a way of getting desperate people to pay them 65 quid is, and
like, you might not then get on
a bit icky. So I decided that it turned out that was
what
I was not willing to do. So I'm not paying you 65 quid to be interviewed to speak at your summit, even if I desperately need it.
Okay, so my invoice of 1,000 isn't going to go down well then.
But if someone's heard this, they could probably hear that if they said, come on my show, it costs 40 quid, I would probably pay it. If it's getting close, it's not a big deal.
Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And definitely go and check out Robbie's website and all the books and podcasts and everything. And connect with both of us, because we really, I'm sure I speak for Robbie as well, we really do love connecting with people who listen to what we're chatting on about. So thank you, Robbie. It's been really great. Take care.